Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Today's episode, we face the bright lights of Hollywood again as we continue our cinematographic journey through Second World War movies, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Hi Jesse, here we are again. Another week, another podcast. We talked about films, good films, bad films in a previous episode. But as always, we got, you might say, completely carried away. We have both had a long list of films that we want to talk about. I think we probably got through about a third. So we decided that we should have a follow-on and talk about some more films, because we have been asked by some of our listeners to talk about films, to talk a little bit, not only about the content of films and what films are out there, but also a little bit about the context. So the context of these films, why are these films made? Is it accurate what they portray? What is the wider context of societies when these films are made? So all these things. So we're opening yet another Pandora's box, you might say, in this particular episode, and go probably quite big before we then zoom in. And I know by talking about going big, Jesse, I know you've got some spoiler warnings, and we probably need to talk about, as I said, the slightly bigger context before we can drill in. So what's the spoiler warning?
Sure, we have a couple of warnings for our listeners. As we did in the previous episode, we're going to talk about what happens in these movies. So if there's a movie on your personal list at home, or you've saved it on your YouTube to watch later list or what have you, and you are worried that we might ruin it for you, press pause, go watch the movie, and come back to this podcast, because we are going to spoil the movies that we talk about for anyone who hasn't seen them. I also want to manage your expectations out there, listeners, because I am not a super movie buff. I'm coming at this from a person who's interested in history and who watches a movie without a kind of expert eye on how movies should be filmed and technical details and so on and so forth. This is me as a viewer coming at it. And I think I can say that's mostly true about Matthias as well, unless he has some film directing background that he's keeping from all of us and that I don't know about.
If only in that case I had a big paycheck as well, I guess, from Hollywood. Unfortunately, I don't. Though this is exactly it. And when I watch films, generally speaking, I very firmly put on my historian's head, which sometimes is quite nice, but most of the time it's utterly frustrating. Sometimes you see the big howlers when, I don't know, they present a Sherman tank and tell you it's a Tiger or something like this. It's the very, very small detail. And I just like picking up these small details. So basically just pointing out where they got it wrong, which makes me sound quite anal and very, very sad. But when it comes to films, I like to do this. I actually know a number of people refuse to watch war movies with me. I'm restraining myself from it normally because quite often it just gets the blood pressure. But I think it's just not worth it. And we'll talk about in this episode, the further we move along in time, and the closer we get to now 2025, generally speaking, very broad brush, the worse my blood pressure gets, I have to say. We can talk about this, and I'm sure it will all come up, why we have these changes, why we have also these different approaches in film, in different countries at different times. I think this in itself is really, really fascinating. Again, taking us away a little bit from just talking about film, but let's really analyze why particular films with particular angles were made at particular periods after World War II. I mean, that in itself tells you a lot, not only about filmmaking, but also about wider aspects of society. So really, really good.
I can tell you, Matthias, that you would make a great Austrian with that approach to things, which is, things used to be better in film in this case. As the Austrians say, früher war alles besser. That's how it goes.
That's what my grandparents said. It wasn't all bad in the good old days. I grew up with that.
Speaking of the old days, I want to get us started today with a classic. I don't know if you've seen it, Matthias. It's a classic, I should say, of Soviet film. It's a film from the 1960s. It's called Father of a Soldier, Отец солдата in Russian. And I like this film. It shows its age. a little bit in terms of how the script is written, in terms of how the acting is done. It's black and white. It's from the 60s, but I do find it compelling. It's the story of a Georgian man from Georgia, from the Georgian Soviet Republic. And it starts, if I'm not mistaken, at the worst stage of the war, pretty much, for the Soviet Union. It's 1942. The Germans have penetrated deep into the southern Soviet Union, into the Caucasus region, which is where Georgia is. And this man is basically a villager, a Georgian villager in the mountains. He's a little bit older. His son is in the Red Army and is wounded. And he finally gets notice that his son is wounded. So the film then really gets going. He goes on a journey, which is not easy for a villager from the edge of the Soviet Union. He goes on a long journey trying to find where is his wounded son, in what hospital, to try to get to him. Turns out that by the time he finds the hospital, his son is off with his unit. And so in order to reach his son, I'm summarizing this because I feel like most people probably haven't seen it. In order to find his son and reconnect with his son, he volunteers for the Red Army. And then they each fight, but they never meet each other. They fight all the way back to Berlin. And they end up then dramatically meeting in a building that the inside of which looks very much like the Reichstag in central Berlin. They don't actually see each other. They hear each other's voices during this frantic final fighting inside the Reichstag against the Germans. And of course, then the son is killed and dies in his father's arms at the end. It is melodramatic. It is a little bit, sanitized. It's the 1960s, and it had to be approved by all the Soviet authorities. But still, there's something that spoke to me about this movie, about this connection between father and son, about the father's simplicity but dedication. So he's a simple peasant. His Russian is not that great, and yet he's dedicated to the cause and he's dedicated to his son. And aside from the fact that, of course, we can and do obviously judge morally the Soviet Union as a system, still, in this context, it's a touching story. And I thought, I liked the movie. And it's been remade. There's been like spin-off films in other languages that go with the same kind of plot line and stuff. But I thought it was pretty good.
No, it's an interesting one. I mean, I have to admit it's been a while since I last saw it, but you just reminded me and told me the whole story. And yes, it is a good film. It fits in again quite nicely with the wider political context of the 1960s as well. So here you've got this farm, and of course it is the Soviet Union. So farmers, peasants, of course, are supposed to be, to a degree, the leading class, if you want to use that word.
The salt of the earth.
Exactly, that's what you get. So here is someone who is devoted to, of course, his son, also, of course, to the cause of the Soviet Union. I think in the very last scene, if I remember correctly, so there's this fighting, as I said, it looks very, very much like Berlin, and they cross this bridge, and there's something which says, well, here's the bridge first crossed by sub-lieutenant, I think that's the term that they use, of the son, and they call him the hero of the Soviet Union. So again, here you can see, so all the sacrifices made, of course, they were for a good purpose. It all made sense. And then, of course, at least the father can then return home when he goes, crosses this bridge, go home to a Soviet Union that's been saved, that's now prosperous, that basically has won the war, isn't it? Single-handedly, you might say. That, of course, is still very much the view in Russia today. It was the Soviet Union that won. The Western allies did not really play a role. We've talked about that in the previous podcast as well. So, again, there is all sorts of propaganda. Don't forget, it is the 60s. It is the time of the Cold War, of course. So all that feeds in. It also is, you might say in many ways, a typical Soviet film. You look at, for example, even the quality, but the acting, and also these whole sub-stories. For a bitter phrase, and I don't want to make too much of this, but this whole idea of the Russian soul, very, very deep, but also very caring, a little bit sad. All these things come out quite nicely. So this idea of, well, he's Georgian, but let's say Georgian/Russian national character is played with as well quite nicely. Also, this whole idea of sacrifice. So the son, of course, first in the hospital, then later on, of course, getting killed. So sacrificing himself for a greater cause. And of course, in many ways, you might say that was very healing as well for people in the Soviet Union. Let's not forget 27 million Soviets died. Quite a few million because of Stalin himself, not only because of the Germans. That's a different story. But these people, first of all, they're dead and they're missing. And if you can then send out a story like this and a film like this, it's quite healing. It's only about 20 years after the war, isn't it? After the war's over. So all these people could make these personal connections with all of these things.
And I think there's also an element that it promotes unity between the Russian majority in the Soviet Union, or plurality in the Soviet Union, and the smaller ethnic groups. Because during the war, there was a lot of suspicion projected against smaller groups like Chechens or Crimean Tatars or Ukrainians, some of whom were not very happy with Russian domination, and some of whom, a minority of whom, collaborated with the Germans, just like a minority of ethnic Russians collaborated with the Germans. And here you have a film where the protagonist is a member of a minority in the Soviet Union, and yet he's dedicated to the cause. And as you say, he sacrifices his son, or his son sacrifices himself for the cause. So there's this kind of message of unity between the different peoples as well, healing not only many personal traumas, but also some political fracture lines as well that the Soviet Union experienced during the war as a result of it, being an empire with a center and a periphery. So I thought that was another interesting element.
There's also another point. I'm not quite sure if that really featured in those days, but when we're talking about this, we say, well, it's the Georgian guy that triggered a thought. And the fact that it was made in the 1960s, the mid-1960s, of course, Stalin himself, well, he was Georgian. And in the 1960s, you've gone through the period of desalinization. So I'm not quite sure if I'm reading too much into this, but maybe that also played a role. So again, trying to heal some of these wounds between Stalin, who came from Georgia, and the wider Russian population. Again, I'm not quite sure if that was an idea. I'd be surprised if that hadn't been picked up by the population in the Soviet Union at the time. But I'm not an expert. It's more of a guess on my behalf.
I like it, though, because Stalin had not been rehabilitated at that time, right? Now, Stalin's a popular guy in Russia, officially and unofficially to a large extent. But in the later 1950s and 1960s, and even afterwards, he was seen critically. And he's a Georgian. So here's a way to kind of resuscitate the Georgians a little bit, including a father figure. And Stalin, of course, presented himself as a fatherly figure as well. But let us not spend the entire podcast on one 1960s Soviet film, as we probably could do if we kept going off on these lovely tangents, losing all our listenership. Matthias, what have you got for us next? You pick the next one for us. Where are we going?
Well, because we talked a little bit about the political context in that period after the war. So that was a 60s film. But if you rewind a little bit and go to the 50s, I think that is also very interesting when you look at the output of the German film industry. Again, you really have to see the political context. So this is the time where Germany's been defeated, Germany is divided. People learned or knew about the atrocities, but they weren't that keen to rock this particular boat. You have to rebuild a country. All these criminals are still amongst you. So you really don't want to talk about that. It's still the idea of the clean war of the Wehrmacht and all the atrocities being committed by the SS. So it's a very difficult time as well within Germany. Then you look at the number of these war films that come out. They really sit very, very well within this wider idea of society. It also meant, as the military said at the time, and most people said, well, if the military had been given the free hand, for example, in the East, they probably would have won. It's all Hitler's fault. Whether it's the conduct of the war, the extermination of the Jews, everything was just Hitler's fault. Just blame him, and everyone else basically is fine. So that was the idea. And that shines through quite nicely in a lot of these films that you get from these days as well. I'm going to talk you through one or two or perhaps three. One of my all-time favorites, I have to say, a war film is it's a German, obviously, I've just talked about it, from the 50s, and the German title is Hunde wollt ihr ewig leben, which translates as Dogs Do You Want to Live Forever. This is a statement which comes from my favorite character in German history, Frederick the Great. I haven't mentioned him in a while, actually. I used to be able to squeeze him into every single episode, so I'm quite happy and glad that I managed to do this right now. He said there's some of these troops in the 7 Years' War who refused to advance towards the enemy. He said, well, dogs, do you want to live forever? Go and fight and get killed. And this is a film about Stalingrad. So we've talked about Stalingrad quite a bit already in our episode and episodes on film. And this is probably the first one, really, at least on the German side, that's made about the Battle of Stalingrad. Again, the story is really interesting. So you've got this young, dashing first lieutenant, an artillery lieutenant, who is sent to Stalingrad. He's flown in. He then works together with other people as a liaison staff to the Romanians, who perform, of course, very, very badly when the Soviets attack. They're then encircled. They keep fighting. He's trying to fight a very clean war, obviously. As always, there's a bit of a love story involved as well with a Russian interpreter that he meets on the way to the front line, and she then joins the Soviet side in Stalingrad itself. You also have these typical tensions that are being brought on already in the 1950s, which is really interesting, between the typical embodiment of German militarism, you might say. So these really kind of nasty characters. So there's one guy who's particularly nasty, who's the head of the liaison team to the Romanians. It just complains about them and said they're useless, they're bad soldiers. And of course, he's the guy who, in the end, then tries to defect and to get over to the Soviet side. He's then actually shot by one of the Germans. So a very interesting subtext and sub-story to it. Again, this whole idea of fighting a clean war. In these conversations, there's a little bit of criticism of the time because this protagonist, he was supposed to have gone to Annapolis. That's the Nazi elite school where the future elite of the Nazi state was trained and educated. And there's a discussion with him on a train with a more traditional lieutenant colonel and a padre. And they say, well, you know what, we don't think what you're doing here is quite right. So there's a bit of that. But apart from that, it's very much trying to fight this clean war. And there's some scenes with Hitler and are basically putting all the blame on Hitler. So one of the last scenes where Hitler again gets a brief and they say, well, you know what, the Sixth Army has surrendered. And he just says, Zeitzler, who's the chief of the general staff, just leave this lamenting. It's just an army, just built a new one. So you can see that this is very interesting. The film is very, very good. There's some very good scenes. Unfortunately, like a lot of these films, I don't think it's ever been dubbed. I might be able to get it subtitled. It's always a bit painful, but there we are. Why I like this film and some of these 1950s films, generally speaking, I mean, you really need to understand the context. If you just watch it, you get this feeling, well, I don't know what was wrong about war on the Eastern Front. It's a very, very clean war. So in that particular film, you don't get anything about Jews or the shooting of prisoners or anything that doesn't happen. It's a very clean war. So you need to have a bit of the historical understanding and the context. What I like about these films, like 2 or 3 other ones, is just the fact it was made in the 1950s. And pretty much all of these people who are acting in these films had served in the military. So it's just, this again, is just how my brain works. I'm just looking at this and they just get it right. It's just very, very simple stuff. The way they salute, the way you do an about turn, there are very specific ways in doing it. I give you one example. Modern films always get that wrong. Listeners, I know you're going to look out for this now. From this day onwards, I've now basically completely ruined your brain. Whenever you're going to watch a war movie from now and you see a German guy saluting, what happens quite often that you've got people standing there with no headdress on. So basically no hat, no cap, no helmet, and they salute. This is plain wrong. That did not happen. That was introduced into the West German army as a consequence of the Americanization of the Bundeswehr, because it's the Americanism. Never happened. You see the old films, they don't do it because they knew how to do this. They had the right sort of drill. It's just this kind of, well, you might call it a sad little thing, but that kind of pleases me that they get this right. So that's what I like about it. The uniforms are right. The decorations are right. They do everything correct. The way they address each other is correct because, again, you had very specific terms. And I've got 2 or 3 other films from that particular period, but I know I've been hijacking the 1950s now. Jesse, is there anything that you would like to add about this period, generally speaking? If you say no, I'm very happy to ramble on and mention a few more films.
To be honest, I have seen part of this film, Hunde wollte ewig leben. I have scenes in my mind, but I don't think I've ever watched the entire thing. I do remember this theme of tension with the Romanians. That's a very interesting one because, of course, the historiography has kind of rehabilitated its assessment to some extent of the Romanian performance at Stalingrad. So that, again, kind of dates this film as a product of its time, if you will. More than that, I don't have a lot to say about 1950s movies, be they American or German, because I haven't seen very many.
I'll keep it short and simple because, again, I know that probably at least the English language listeners to our podcast will probably not have heard of these films, will not have seen them because I think they're just available in German, really. Another very famous one also from that period is Die Brücke, which translates as The Bridge. It's very, very famous, at least in Germany. It was there's a remake from, I don't know, the early 2000s. As most remakes, it's pretty awful. Don't watch it. It's a very strong movie again, and this is more about the suffering. So very, very briefly, the story is a group of schoolboys in a German town. We're now in 1945, the war's coming to an end, and they are drafted into the army. They're going through their basic training, and about 2 days into their basic training, the Americans arrive. Alarm, everyone out of the barracks. And this group, this section of about 9 or 10 of these boys are given this completely unimportant task of guarding a bridge. That's why it's called The Bridge. And they're given this because, well, there's discussion before and with the section commander and the commanding officer, and they say, you know what, these guys don't know anything. They're just getting in the way. Give them that bridge. It'll keep them occupied. They will not do any harm, and that'll be the end of it. Don't let them do any fighting. Well, then happens, of course, the Americans arrive, and there is a very, very big fight, and most of them, with the exception of 1 or 2, actually get killed. And so these are 16-year-old boys. So, and that's again is a film from the 1960s, very, very strong. Again, most of these boys became very famous actors then in Germany. And again, context is key. It very much concentrates on, of course, the suffering of the German. There's, for example, also one scene where one of the boys who lives in a big estate, and they've got all these foreign workers, the slave laborers, you might say. They're all from the East and some French. And of course, they get on very, very nicely and very, very well. Obviously, they do. So you can see again this whole idea of guilt doesn't really exist, but it's a very, very strong film within the contextuality of the 1950s. And then from the German side, the last one is a trilogy, and it's called 0815. I don't know, Jesse, have you seen that one? Does that ring a bell?
I have not, but I know the reference is to a First World War machine gun.
It is very much so. So the first machine gun introduced into the German army, 0815. It's, by the way, it's still a term that's being used today in German language. Is that the same in Austria, Jesse, or is it just in Germany proper?
No, I've heard it in Austria as well. It just means a run-of-the-mill something or other. A 0815 XYZ, just a normal one, common one.
Yeah, exactly. So if you something very normal, something, well, if you have to carry out a task as well, if it's very repetitive, not particularly exciting, this is it's very normal, it's very standard, it's very 0815. Still in common usage in Germany today. I don't think anyone really knows where the term comes from, but there's a military reference. And so it's a trilogy, 3 parts. The first one is a few guys going through basic training in Germany. The second one is on the Eastern Front. The last one is at the end of the war, and they're following a number of people through. And again, you get this whole idea of he's a very clever guy who then became probably the most famous actor in Germany, Joachim Fuchsberger, he was called, after this trilogy, and he's quite clever, and he kind of tries to outmaneuver this very stupid military system where everyone just obeys orders. And of course, there are all sorts of frictions, and it works really well. And again, they play quite nicely with some of these tensions because, for example, when they get to Eastern Front, there is this new captain that's sent there, and he wants to win the Iron Cross, a bit like Steiner, the Iron Cross, if you've ever seen that film. So it's similar to that, and you can see these tensions there. And the very last ones, there are then some evil SS people as well who go around killing people. So again, it's a very traditional view of the world, you might say. Generally speaking, stupid military, some clever people in it, and then the evil SS. But again, it's a famous trilogy. If you get the right context, put your thinking hat on, these are very good films. If you just watch them, as I've now said a number of times, they are not so good. I've got a few other 1960s films, also English-speaking ones, but I'm not quite sure if we want to leave the 60s behind and go somewhere else, because I've been talking for quite some time now.
I would say, you know what I suggest? That we move to a theme and we go with Normandy films, because that'll allow you to bring up one of your all-time favorite classics, if I read the list right.
Correct.
And it'll allow me to talk a bit about one of my all-time favorites, which is not a perfect film, and it's an American film. We haven't talked very much about American films.
No, we haven't.
In this episode or in the previous one. It's new and uncharted ground, I'm sure, for many of our listeners. So we hope that you find that interesting. But I'm going to return to a Hollywood classic here from my teenage years, Saving Private Ryan.
Oh, God, yes.
I think it was, 94, 95, somewhere right around there, around the 50th anniversary of the D-Day landings and the end of World War II. And I think that in the former Allied countries of the West, there's this sense of historical urgency to memorialize, to remember, because the veterans at that stage are entering, into the final years of life, essentially. My grandfather was a veteran of the Normandy campaign, not the landing itself on D-Day, but the Normandy campaign. And he passed away in 1998, for example. So this is the time when we're kind of looking back. And I think that informs why Spielberg sort of chose this story, which I'm sure all of our listeners know, about the main character who starts off as an old man, kind of like many people's fathers and grandfathers were at that time in the mid-1990s. And then, of course, there's the whole story about looking for him because his brothers have been killed and so on. Why did I like the movie? It can be and has been criticized for some of its historical flaws. Maybe, Matthias, you will have also an opinion on that. But 14-year-old me and 40-something-year-old me today likes the movie. I like the movie, that opening scene, which is, one of the most famous scenes now in the history of film, I would say. The opening scene on the beach with the shaky camera and some very gory and sudden occurrences, on the beach. To me, that really opened my eyes to some of the realities of warfare. I don't think I'd ever seen the violence of warfare, the impact of warfare on the human body portrayed in that way before that film. Not saying there weren't any. There were. Some of the films we mentioned in our previous episode and so on that are older did deal with some of the gory aspects. But for me, this was like, wow, super impactful. And the storyline after that, it's a bit forced. They're wasting a whole bunch of skilled men and an officer and so on to go find some paratrooper. You probably wouldn't feel that that's worth the resources that you might lose to do that. So it's a bit pushed, it's a bit forced. But at the same time, it just seemed so realistic to 14-year-old me. The planes with the stripes, the tanks, the uniforms, the machine guns, and then a little bit of moral ambiguity, right? Where they capture the German prisoner. Do they shoot him? No. But then he comes back and is shooting at them and kills the sergeant and so on and so forth. Oh, by the way, a lot of YouTube viewers think that I look a lot like that German soldier, nicknamed Steamboat Willie, by the way, who they let go and who comes back and then shoots them. People think I look like him. I don't know. What do you think, Matthias? Do you see it?
Actually, now that you mention it, yes. Yeah. Yeah, maybe you should get your uniform out of the cupboard. Yeah.
Lovely. I do not have a German World War II uniform in my cupboard, just so the public is aware of that.
I do. Yeah. There we go. It's my great uncle's one who came back from Stalingrad in the 1950s. Well, there we go.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
My grandfather wore out his uniform because he got a job right after the war. Slight digression here. He got a job right after the war working on the telegraph lines along the railway in Canada. And his uniform was one of the most durable wool things that he had. So he wore the thing out. So that was it for that.
Well, my father made me wear it to Carnival together with my grandfather's steel helmet. So that tells you that, well, it's not my fault that my brain's broken. I'm interested in military history. So these were the days. You wouldn't get away with it anymore, I guess.
Podcast therapy today, folks. Yeah. But what did you think of Saving Private Ryan, Matthias? I don't remember where it was on your list, if it was on your good or not so good list.
It's a bit neither here nor there, to be perfect, Lewis, because just like you had exactly the same thing. So when the film came out, I remember I went to the cinema 6 times to watch it. Even at that stage, I thought, this is a bit crazy, but I was just drawn to it. And
nerd alert.
Exactly. And it was mainly, as you just said, it's the first, whatever it is, 20 minutes or so of that opening battle scene. And it is pretty accurate. It's probably, particularly at that time, now, of course, technology has moved on a bit, but it's still probably as accurate as it can get. When you then move on, I think you're absolutely right. The whole story is slightly forced. It's a bit... forgive me, it's a bit too Hollywood for me, but it works with the storyline, so that is fine. Yes, of course, you got the German in there. I mean, on the other side, you also have, at least to a degree, showing some of the general nastiness of war, because there is the shooting of these Germans that surrender when they come out of the bunker, and then the people laugh about this, and you could say it's interesting debating point. I've used the scene actually with the army and saying, okay, do you think this is a war crime, yes or no? Because technically, of course, it is, because these guys have got their hands up. Then other people said no, because that's still the heat of battle. There is still a difference between shooting people in this moment where you're still kind of full of adrenaline, what have you, or shooting someone in cold blood half an hour later. So interesting debates there as well. As I said, I've used that scene a number of times to talk about all these things with military audiences. So really quite fascinating. Yes, the further in you go, the more forced it gets. And of course, the end is very, very Hollywood. So that doesn't do anything for me, I have to say. But on the whole, the opening scene is very, very, very strong. So that's very true.
I think the opening scene felt like 20 minutes to all of us, but I'd be very interested to see it's probably like 5 or 7 minutes.
I've got no idea.
It just feels like 20 minutes. Maybe it's even 4 minutes. I don't know, but because you can't keep up that intensity for so long. One thing I found very interesting about that scene you mentioned where the Americans shoot these Germans who are coming out of the bunker trying to, putting their hands up. If I recall right, they were not speaking German. They were speaking like Czech or Polish. And one of the units on Omaha Beach had some Poles in it that were forced to serve, if I remember right. This kind of
Osttruppen. There were quite a few there. Yeah.
Osttruppen, yeah, exactly. So I thought that was quite an interesting touch. Even though it is kind of Hollywood, I still like the movie. There's a lot of Hollywood movies about World War II that I don't really like, and maybe I'll touch on another one or two of those in this movie, Fury. But
oh my God, don't get me started.
it'll come. Although it has its redeeming features too, Fury does. But one last little remark about Saving Private Ryan. One thing did annoy me more than the rest, which was the Monty bashing. There's this one scene where I think Ted Danson's character is like complaining that the British are too slow and that's why we're not doing X, Y, or Z. That really annoys me when that comes up in Hollywood movies. Not that I'm a total Monty fan or anything like that. It's just you can't blame the guy for everything that happened on the Western Front in 1944 and 1945. So that was my little thing. But I have to say, love Saving Private Ryan.
There's another Normandy film that I particularly like, and I would say, again, it's probably one of my favorite war movies ever. Again, it's black and white. I've got a thing for black and white movies, actually. And
you're old, Matthias.
I'm very old. Yeah, I feel very old too. It's the weight of the world on my shoulders. There we go. And this film was actually made in 1962. And that's also when it was released. And that is, of course, The Longest Day, which is not only The Longest Day, it's also the longest movie because it goes on forever. But actually, it doesn't feel long because it's so, I would say, it's so well done for a number of reasons. The story, of course, it's obvious, it's clear, but it goes into a lot of detail. Again, it starts with the preparation for D-Day. And then, of course, it looks at the fighting in depth from different angles. And I think this is really the interesting thing, that you have all the different nationalities represented. And I think that makes a huge difference to this film, particularly compared to anything that comes after this. When you then go too far into the Hollywood area, and this whole idea, again, we're talking about context, and this whole idea of the Americanization of the Second World War. You get this to a degree, but not that much. So it's quite level between the Americans. You've got the French in there, particularly with the resistance and other groups, the British, and of course also the Germans. And it's quite, the way all these people are portrayed is relatively straightforward, if just is the right word, or correct.
Fair.
So that works. But I also find fascinating is that they actually recorded it twice. So you have Americans playing Americans, you've got Brits playing Brits, you've got French guys playing French guys, you've got Germans playing Germans. By the way, German listeners, if you know who Loriot is, one of the most famous German comedians, he had his very first role in that particular film. And they record this in their native tongues, and then also they dub it later on so you can watch it in English as well. So again, I think that is just this little touch of what reality, you might say, which really works quite well. And again, what I've said about some of the other films, the German films, applies here as well. So this is done in the 1960s. So these guys had either been there or they at least had the right advisors. They knew how these things worked, and factually, it's actually quite correct. And of course, there are some glitches in there, but on the whole, it's quite correct. And some of the fascinating stories, you got one of the British actors who plays Major John Howard in the movie. He was actually fighting in that exact area. So Pegasus Bridge, where the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry land, and in the night of the 5th to the 6th of June 1944. He was there as a ranker. And then later on, he plays his OC from the real action. So it's quite funny. Of course, the one character that really stands out in many ways, because he's the famous one, is, of course, John Wayne. He plays a very famous role because he plays Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort, so American paratrooper. Fascinating story around it. I mean, let's not dig too much into in John Wayne's war record because it's quite thin. But so again, sometimes you get these glitches. So John Wayne was 55 when the film was made, so that made him 28 years older than Vandervoort was on D-Day, and 10 years older than Vandervoort was in 1962. So he's quite an old bugger, really, to be perfectly honest.
It sounds like most of the war roles that Tom Hanks has been involved with.
It's a bit like that, yes, exactly. Or some other actors. Well, we turn to Fury maybe in a minute, where you probably have the oldest sergeant in the history of sergeants, but there we go. What's also interesting about John Wayne, of course, is that everybody on this movie was offered, so the main character was offered $25,000 as payment. John Wayne received $250,000 because he was such a big name. So that in itself is also quite interesting. You also have some interesting connections being made. That's right. So Sean Connery is in there. It's his last role before he then becomes James Bond. Gerd Fröbe, the German actor, he plays this bumbling German NCO, slightly overweight. He, of course, then plays Goldfinger. So you can see it's interesting how the international acting scene came together in this particular film. Another interesting episode is while they were shooting this and they were having one of these mock attacks and all these explosions were going off, actually the German war cemetery at La Combe, so the main cemetery in Normandy, was opened. And so while you were having these speeches, you had all these explosions going off close to the sea. So, of course, you can imagine that was, I'm not quite sure if that went down well or not, but it's just, again, an interesting story. So I think it's an absolutely outstanding film because of the way the nationalities are portrayed, and also because they give themselves time to tell the story. So it is a very long film, but it doesn't feel particularly long. So I'm a huge fan of that film.
I'm going to shock probably everybody listening here. I have not seen The Longest Day. I've read part of the book. I've seen a few scenes from it, but I've never actually sat there and watched the entire film. So mea culpa, I don't have a lot to add. It's on my list of classic films that I should have watched by now, and it'll come one day.
Maybe you need to do a Clockwork Orange and be restrained in a chair and have your eyelids kind of pulled back and then just made to watch it. So I think that's probably it. Yeah.
I'm sure half of our listeners are thinking the same thing right now. But since you mentioned Fury, why don't we move on to Fury? Because I get the feeling that between the two of us, it's a bit of a controversial film in some ways. Here's my take, at least. Okay, how about this? I'll get the ball rolling for us on Fury. I think this film kind of reflects American cynicism about war during the kind of Great War on Terror, after the never-ending wars that don't go well in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, they were told these are just wars. We're going in there to get, justice for 9/11 into Afghanistan, and then it turns into something else. They were told they were going to Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction. Turns out that wasn't true. Then, of course, there are these scandals that come out about US and other Australians and others' behavior and crimes in these two countries, in these two conflicts. And so I think part of the flavor of Fury is about that it's very dark, that a lot of the American characters, they're not heroic, right? Some of them are cynical themselves. Some of them are cruel. Some of them are callous. They shoot people who are unarmed and so on and so forth. So I think it's kind of got that dark vibe of jadedness that I think a lot of American society felt about its current wars, and that's sort of projected, I feel, maybe a bit too strongly onto World War II, which was a different time, a different war. And as far as I've read, most people fighting it, not that they were all nice guys, but they had a different attitude about what they were doing. And so I feel like Fury is its own kind of historical artifact like the other films. The thing that I really disliked was the scenes with the tank combat. With the Tiger.
Oh my God.
It just about, I'm not a tank expert. I'm not a tank tactics expert. But for the love of Peter, that was bad.
It really is. It's mind-boggling. So just because of that particular scene or these scenes, my personal opinion, one of the worst films ever made in history. And it's just, well, I'm not quite sure what I would do
Tell us how you
to the
really
actors.
feel.
But I need to restrain myself here, otherwise I might get locked up. You never know. But no, I think it's absolutely awful. I think I don't like anything about the film. I think you're absolutely right. And you need, again, this is the important thing, isn't it, dear listeners? You always need to understand these things within the context. And Jesse, you talked about it. It's the war on terror. It really talks to, perhaps you might say, the American soul at that particular time. I think that is very, very obvious. And it oozes, well, 2014, I think it's when it came out, if I'm not mistaken. It really oozes that particular period also in American history. So that's very clear. That's also perhaps where the rawness comes in and all these things. So perhaps, I don't want to make too much of this, but you talked about the characters, but in the end, they're fighting for a good cause. So isn't that somewhat similar to fighting the war on terror? And it's quite easy to make these particular links if you want to. But again, putting on my historian's hat, and you just mentioned it, I mean, everything that happens in that film is just so shockingly, ridiculously stupid and bad. It is really, it's absolutely awful. I don't even know what to say. So it starts with the main actor, and girls, forgive me, I know that women like Brad Pitt, but he is obviously the oldest staff sergeant that ever served in uniform, or sergeant, I think he is. So that's where it all starts going wrong. The whole interaction with the German population is silly. And yes, you're absolutely right. Well, the worst thing is these battle scenes, which are so ridiculously, stupidly staged that you couldn't make it up. I mean, the only good thing in all these scenes is, because if I remember correctly, they actually use, I think it's Tiger 131, if I'm not mistaken. So it's the Tiger tank from Bovington, so the tank museum. So that's the only good thing that you really see in that entire movie, I would argue. So it's, I find it, shocking.
I wouldn't go, I'm not as upset about it as you, but
I sound really angry here, don't I? Yes, it's my God.
You are outraged.
Yeah.
You are outraged.
And here's another thing. Yeah.
I don't feel as outraged as you. I came away with very mixed feelings from the film. I was like, okay, I kind of see the message of the jadedness and all of that, and okay, that's part of people participating in every war. Many of them become cynical by the nature of what war is. But yeah, it left me nonplussed, I would say. And of course, I didn't really appreciate the way that the armored combat scenes played out. Do we have time for one last kick at the can for this episode? And who gets to pick it? Should we flip a digital coin? Are you pointing at me?
I'm pointing at you because I've been talking about 1950s film for quite a while now, actually. So your choice.
I'll leave us with a bit of an exception, a bit of a different film. It's not really about combat very much. There's one combat scene, maybe a couple of combat scenes in it. It's a Russian film from the early 2000s called Kukushka, which in English means cuckoo, like a cuckoo bird. And it's set in the Arctic, basically. And it's set in 1944 towards the end of what's called the Continuation War. So this kind of partly separate war going on between Finland and the Soviet Union during World War II from 1941 till 1944, which is called the Continuation War, of course, because they had the Winter War in 39-40 where the Soviets took a bunch of Finnish territory. The Finns tried to take it back. But it's not about all that. It's not about the wider war. It's about three people, three very different people, a Finnish soldier, a Soviet soldier, and a local Sami woman. The Sami are an ethnic group that live in northern Finland and northern Sweden. They're like reindeer herders and stuff, natives to the area, if you will. And these three people end up kind of by strange circumstances trapped together, trying to survive in this very harsh environment, living in this woman's hut. Her husband has been taken away by the Germans. The Finnish soldier was accused of cowardice or wanting to turn himself in by the Germans and shackled to a stone, manages to free himself. The Soviet was accused by the NKVD of making anti-Soviet statements, so he's being taken to a penal colony in the north when, lo and behold, the Germans strafe the vehicles and kill all the guards except him. So the three of them are all up there and need each other to survive, and they don't speak each other's languages. And that's one of the fascinating parts of the film, is because then, in the context of war, you get everything else stripped away. There's no armies with them. They're not with units. they can't even communicate. So they can't even talk about the war or what they think about the war or articulate it that way. They manage to survive. They manage to communicate. Of course, there ends up being a weird three-way love story and stuff. The Russian guy is scheming against the Finn because he doesn't know who he really is. He thinks he's a member of the SS and so on. And so it really strips it down. It's a bit of an optimistic film about human nature in a way. Even though there's hatred, even though the Russian guy shoots the Finn, he then realizes his mistake, that the war is over, and he helps him, and the Sami woman helps him. It's almost like if you strip everything else away down to our humanity, to the point that they can't even talk and express those political ideas, that there's some kind of commonality, that there's some kind of goodness, whether it's helping, whether it's mutual survival, or whether it's, love, because they end up in this love triangle thing without hating each other because of it, which is, I think, quite rare in real life. That's probably a fiction. So I thought it was a pretty powerful film. It has a very funny moment where, because they don't understand each other, the Finn asks the Russian, "Hey, what's your name?" right at the beginning. And the Russian, he's like, "I'm not talking to this Nazi." So in Russian, he says, "Pasholty," which is, the nice version is "get lost." The actual version is "fuck off." I think I can say that on a podcast.
You're allowed now, yeah.
And so the Sami woman and the Finn, they think his name is Psholti. And so that's what they call him every time. They basically nicknamed this guy "fuck off." So it's a pretty funny element of the film. And the woman then ends up having two children, one by each of them, and she names the son of the Russian Psholti.
Yeah.
So I thought the film was cool. It's not your typical war film. It's a much more artsy, much more humanistic, softer type of look. But it spoke to me. It was revealing.
I know what you mean, and I think one of the websites where you have all these reviews, it was actually called "A Sweet and Amusing Comedy." So again, talking to what you've just said, I'm not quite sure if that was the real intention, but it's part of it. But again, coming back to what we've now said and stressed time and again, so you always have to look at the context of this film. So this film, if I remember correctly, came out in 2002. And of course, that's a fundamentally different time in Russia, in that part of the world. Look at the relationship with the Baltic states, with Finland. Generally speaking, the relationship with other nations, so fundamentally different from what we can see today. So I'm quite sure that today you wouldn't be able to make such a film anywhere in Russia.
Oh, you'd be in prison.
That's exactly it. So it's, again, fascinating how these films, generally speaking, whether it's the films from the 1950s we talked about, the 60s, the 80s, the previous episode we talked about, for example, Das Boot from the 1980s, how these really embody the times, the societies, and also the historiography and the understanding of history that people have at the time. So through films, you can actually understand what mainstream society thinks, or perhaps you might say is encouraged to think by filmmakers. Because quite often, let's face it, filmmakers are a bit more avant-garde than mainstream society. But you do have these links. And quite often, it's just there in the margins. But sometimes, and I think here's a very good example, you can see direct link between society, history, politics at that time, and filmmaking. And this is really, really fascinating. This is, I think, why this episode is really worthwhile listening to and talking about these things, because it's not just to people who read more books than watch movies, talk about films, and pretend that they know an awful lot about films they've never seen before. But it's much more about this. It's much more about the context itself. And I think that's absolutely fascinating.
And I will say, on a personal note, I'm very nostalgic for the state of European relations as expressed in the time of that film in the early 2000s compared to the state of what European security relations are today.
And you can see, again, this being played out, for example, in another film. We said we're just going to look at one, but you just triggered a thought here. There's a mini-series, a 3-part mini-series. Again, it's a German one. It's called Unsere Mütter, Unsere Väter in German. In English, it's called Generation War. The story it tells is of a group of friends from Berlin, their experiences in the war. So you've got a number of girls there. One becomes a nurse, one becomes a famous singer. You've got a Jewish guy there who needs to go into hiding, is then on the way to Auschwitz, then manages to escape from the train and joins Polish partisans. And then you've got two brothers. One's at the beginning, he's already a lieutenant and he's kind of the war hero. The other one, Friedhelm, he is very anti-war, he's very cynical, he's very critical. But he later on becomes basically a killing machine, just goes around shooting people, including civilians, because he's so broken, disillusioned. The other one, his brother Wilhelm, he has a nervous breakdown, ends up in the penal battalion. So it's a very good story. Again, looking at the human dimension. It was criticized quite a lot in Germany as well, because it doesn't really show the bigger suffering, so the whole idea of the Nazi state. There's a bit of that comes out in one of the characters who has an affair with the party leader. But apart from that, it's, again, in inverted commas, within this little circle, it's quite clean. There's lots of Nazi stuff happening. For example, shooting of civilians, using civilians basically as mine shields that drive them into swamps where they get blown up by mines. So there's nasty stuff happening. But the one thing I thought was really interesting, and that's what triggered the thought while you were talking, again, is the political context. Again, I know the historical advisors, extremely good historians. They know exactly what they're doing. But there is one scene or a number of scenes where the Polish partisans are portrayed in a very specific light. And basically, that means they're very, very anti-Jewish. And there's statements by one of these guys where there's only one thing we like less than a German, that's a Jew, and things like this. And they stop a train because they want to get weapons out. First half is weapons. The second half is Jews just basically put onto this train. So this Jewish guy who's there said, aren't we going to rescue them? And they said, why would we? They're just Jews, so let them die. And what's really interesting that this caused a diplomatic incident. And the German ambassador in Poland had to go and kind of explain the film and probably also to a degree apologize to the Polish authorities. So again, you can see how this plays, or it's the same context, doesn't have to do anything to do with films, but this whole terminology of concentration extermination camps, because quite often they're called Polish extermination camps. Well, and the Poles make very sure, no, they're not Polish. They are German extermination camps on Polish territory. So you can see how this happens and develops. It was also interesting talking to the main historical advisor afterwards, and he said, I'm not quite sure what they're complaining about because here are the sources. So a very, very good historian, meticulously researched. But again, in the context of history and the interpretation of history, seen in a very different light in specific countries. I think, again, it's all about the context, which makes all of this really interesting.
Yeah, I've seen parts of that series. I admit I haven't watched the entire thing through. I did read a little bit about the controversies that you mentioned. I think often in films, in this case, historical films, something that's very important is how much weight do you give one portrayal of something that can be a reasonable, defensible historical interpretation versus how much weight do you give another one? And that relationship can really dictate how your film is portrayed, or how your film, I should say, is interpreted or seen, and how upset people might get about a certain element of it or not. And I think one of the aspects that was part of this criticism of this series, Generation War, is that you have this quite blunt anti-Semitism amongst the Polish partisans. And of course, anti-Semitism was a widespread feeling in not only Poland, but all of Europe pretty much at the time. So it's not surprising that Polish nationalists would express some anti-Semitic ideas, although of course many other Poles helped and saved local Jews. But I feel like part of, presenting that quite bluntly versus what some people saw as a bit of idealizing the social relationships in the German character group with the Jewish German, and not kind of pushing a bit enough on how many non-German Jews didn't treat their Jewish countrymen very kindly at all, or took the opportunity to inflict harm on them or take their apartments and so on and so forth. It doesn't mean that every German did that. It doesn't mean that you need to portray it that way in the film. But if you're going a bit soft on one ugly part of history, but you go a bit more direct on another, that is also a politically sensitive one, then that, I think, is one of those gaps where that criticism sort of came about.
Maybe my last and final point on this particular miniseries, which is very interesting as well, I find, when you look at the actors, of course, they're all German. Whenever you have a film or a series that takes place in the 1920s or 1930s or 1940s at the moment, it's always these actors that also play that group. You might have perhaps seen Babylon Berlin. So the actor there is also the main actor in Babylon Berlin. So the guy who plays Wilhelm, one of the brothers in Generation War. And I just think it's interesting, not because of that group. I'm thinking about another film, and that we haven't talked about this, so we're not going to go into it. Because, again, you can talk about this for a long, long time. There was a German film by a director called Wilsmeyer that was called Stalingrad from the 1990s. But the only point, I'm not going to talk about the film, but there was an interview with him afterwards, and I thought that was really, really interesting. And he said the biggest challenge he had as a director was to find faces that looked like 1940 faces. When you put them in a 1940 uniform, that do not look like they're from the 1990s or now 2025. I thought that was quite interesting. And it's quite true when you look at pictures from the time or even film material, these people look slightly different. First of all, they just look much older, don't they? They always look about 10 years older than a 20, 30-year-old would look today. So it's really quite striking. Actually, I never even thought of that before this guy mentioned that in an interview. I thought it was an interesting point that he made.
Indeed, an interesting point to end off what I thought was quite an interesting episode. I hope that all of you listeners felt the same way. If you have a bone to pick with one of our takes on one of these movies, good or bad, of course, do send us a message, leave a comment, leave a review of the podcast as well. That helps us out. And if you really want to get into it and you want to get a response from us personally, of course, you can always join our members community at bothsidesofthewire.com. And we even have a discount code for you. Matthias's favorite expression, Deep Dark Woods, all one word, for your code at bothsidesofthewire.com. So that was it for the episode today. We've not exhausted our list. I do think that at some point in the future, we're going to have to return to World War II movies and cover some of the other ones that we didn't get to. But that's it for today, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. So I don't want to prattle on about it without having seen any of them. So take us through one or two more, Matthias.
Or you just do what a lot of historians do. You just make stuff up and people will believe
We do
you.
not
Because that
do that
happens
here.
all the time.
We do not do that here. You can quote me on that.